One day the angels came to present themselves to the Lord, and Satan came with them. The Lord said to Satan,
"Where have you come from?"
Satan answered the Lord,
"From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it."
Then the Lord said to Satan,
"Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil."
"Does Job fear God for nothing?"
Satan replied,
"Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now, stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face."
The Lord said to Satan,
"Very well then. Everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger."
Well, you just heard a throwdown that happened in the throne room of God probably about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and it surrounded the life of Job. And Satan came into God's throne room, and he challenged God, and he said, "God, the only reason that anybody in this world serves you is because you give them stuff. You give them blessing, you give them reward, you give them family, you take care of them. It is the only reason, God, that people serve you." And God said to Satan, essentially, "I'm going to show you, Satan, that that's not true. And I'm going to offer up to you the most righteous man in all the earth, the man in whom I am the most proud, and it's this man named Job. He's the greatest man who loves me with everything he has. And I will remove my hand of protection from Job to show you that despite whatever you do to him, he will continue to serve and love me." Have you ever watched a show or a movie where you were given access to information as an audience that the characters of the story are not given in the show? So right now, Jan and I, we're getting into a show called Designated Survivor. We have any Designated Survivor fans out there? All right, we got a few. Great show. It's a show about Tom Kirkman, who ends up becoming the president of the United States when the rest of the United States government is taken out in a terrorist attack. And throughout the show, the whole plot of the show, you don't know who Tom's enemies are, and you don't know who his foes are. You're not sure. And we just went through an episode, we're watching it on Netflix together, we just went through an episode where it's revealed to us as the members of the audience watching the show that one of the close associates of Tom Kirkman, the President of the United States, is actually an evil person. He thinks this individual is good. He thinks this person is on his side. But he doesn't have access to information that we have access to as the audience. And so we're rooting for him, and we're waiting for it to be unraveled, sort of the whole thing to be unveiled for him so that he can see what's going on around him, so that he can see the truth. And in the book of Job, that's exactly what takes place at the beginning of the story. God writes the story in such a way that you and I, as the audience, you and I, as the people who read this story, are able to see what's going on behind the scenes, and we're given access to information that Job and his wife and his friends and his servants are not given. The characters of the story do not know that God and Satan are at war with each other. They don't understand how badly Satan hates people, particularly people who follow God with their lives. They don't get how much Satan is hell-bent on the destruction of people who worship God, and how Satan will do anything he can to try to humiliate God and undercut God's work in this world, including terrorizing and killing people. Satan is willing to do that. But we as the audience in the book of Job are given access to this information. And Job doesn't know at this moment that what he's about to walk through is absolutely the worst season that he will ever face. In fact, probably the worst season that any human being may have ever faced in all time. Job doesn't understand that God is going to be using his life to write a story that for thousands of years will be used by people to understand how to live through a bad day. Job can't see any of that. He can't see Satan's work. He can't see God's master's plan. All he can do is live through a really, really bad day and a really, really bad season. I want to welcome you to week 2 of the series, How to Live Through a Bad Day. And we are unpacking the book of Job. We're looking at what God did through him. We told you last week that Job was known as the greatest man of the East in his day. He lived all the way back in the times of Genesis, in our very first book of the Bible. This is a really old story, and Job's story was so profound that the Hebrew people decided to write it down and record it so that many, many generations to come would have a record of how to go through pain in life. We told you last week that we wished it were true. In fact, I wish it were true that bad days weren't going to come at you. I wish it were true that we would just have endless good days. Your job would always work. Your marriage would always work. Financially, you'd always be okay. There'd always be hope. There'd never be problems. You wouldn't have the loss of loved ones in your life. But the truth is, as we know and as we understand, that that's not the way this all works, is it? That there are bad days and bad seasons. They do come. They do come. And in Job's story, Job starts out the story in chapter 1. We learn that he's the wealthiest man on the face of the earth. He has 7,000 sheep at his disposal. He has 3,000 camels, 500 oxen, 500 donkeys. Job is a man who has servants all around. He's an invited guest into every room that he walks into. He has everything he could want. He is the equivalent of a modern-day billionaire. That's Job's story. Job essentially is a billionaire. In fact, Job is probably the billionaire of billionaires, because that's why the scriptures say he's the greatest man in the East. Maybe there's somebody in the West who rivals Job's power and wealth. In Job's day, he had off-the-charts level of wealth. But we're also told, as we shared last week, that Job was a very, very righteous man. Job kind of did everything right. So we learn in Job chapter 1 that Job was so committed to God that he would actually sacrifice to God on behalf of his children's sins. Even if he wasn't sure if his children had sinned against God, he would offer up sacrifices to God on their behalf just in case they had done something wrong, because he didn't want his children to go sideways with God. We're told in Job chapter 31, Job unpacks his own defense before God of the kind of life that he lived. And he said, God, I turned my eyes away from evil. I turned my eyes away from younger women. I never pursued a woman who was not my wife. I stayed sexually pure before you. He says, God, I gave away my wealth. I gave it away to people, and I blessed the poor, and I helped people. I never held on to wealth as the foundation of my life. And Job, we discover throughout the book, is a very, very, very righteous man. Which is why, when Satan shows up in the throne room, and he has a throwdown with God, that God actually offers up Job's name as someone to be considered, because God is so proud of the life Job is living. And this is what makes the story of Job so amazing, is that God is so overwhelmingly proud of Job for the life he's living, and yet Job has to go through the worst season that anybody's ever had to live through. That's not fair, is it? That's not fair. It's not fair that Job had to go through pain, but that's exactly what happens. And so after this throwdown in the throne room of God, God says, okay, Satan, I'm going to take my hand of protection off of him. I'm going to let you have access to his life. Satan, you can do virtually anything you want to him, but don't you take his life away from him. And this is what Satan does. Are you ready for this? Satan leaves God's throne room. We get to verse 13 of chapter 1, and it says these words, one day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you. So Satan, the first thing that he does is he raises up this kind of raiding party from a neighboring group of people known as the Sabeans. The Sabeans sweep in, they come down on the oxen and the donkeys, and they put all of Job's servants to the sword. All the people who would have cared for that amount of livestock get put to the sword. They all die. This is totally unfair. Totally unfair to Job, totally unfair to the people that work for Job, isn't it? It doesn't make any level of sense to us. And this messenger comes running to Job and says, Job, you got to hear what happened. The Sabeans, they swept in, they killed everybody, they took all of your oxen and donkeys. And just like that, an enormous portion of Job's wealth is gone in one message. I imagine that Job kind of stepped back and kind of was reeling from that and thinking, trying to process what just happened to him. Where do I go from here? Do I try to raise up an army and go back after my cattle? Do I try to go and punish the people who have done this? What do I do? Do I just let them go? What's my next move? And before Job can come to any level of conclusion on how he's supposed to respond, here's what happened. While he was still speaking, that is, while that messenger was still delivering the message of the Sabeans taking all of Job's cattle, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you." Job hasn't even processed the first message yet. He hasn't even had a chance yet to figure out exactly what this means for his life. And now another messenger comes and says, Job, 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 you're not going to believe what happened. The fire of God came down, and the fire burned up all of your sheep. All 7,000 of your sheep, Job, are gone. All of the servants who served with those sheep and took care of those sheep are gone. Just like that. Now this messenger who comes to Job is like you and me. They're a normal, everyday person who serves a very wealthy individual, and this messenger doesn't know that the fire is not actually from God. Because like you and me, they can't see what's going on behind the scenes in the heavenlies. They can't see the story. They can't hear the interaction between Satan and God. They don't know what's taking place in the spiritual realm. So their only interpretation is to run to their boss, to Job, and say, God sent a fire. It was God's fault the fire fell down. They have no idea that it's actually Satan's fault. Satan is totally responsible for the fire that came down and killed those sheep and killed those servants. Now Job has had two messages that have hit him, and they've been awful, awful messages. I imagine that Job is probably ready to fall to the floor, probably ready to collapse to the ground, not knowing what to do. And the bad news keeps on coming, because verse 17 says this: while he was still speaking, while the second messenger was still giving the message, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties, and they swept down on your camels and they made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job has had no break through these messages. No moment of pause. No moment to reflect. No moment to gather his thoughts. And in these 3 messages, what he finds out is that his entire economic foundation is utterly destroyed. The Sabeans have made off with all of his donkey and all of his oxen, and they've killed everybody who works for him. The fire that is proclaimed to be from God, but is actually from Satan, falls down and kills all 7,000 of his sheep and all the employees who work with him. The Chaldeans, another people group, sweep in and make off with the 3,000 camels, put everybody to the sword who works for Job. And just like that, Job's entire economic kingdom is totally removed from his hands. Every bit of it. He goes from being the billionaire of his day to having nothing economically, nothing financially. Imagine if somebody came to you and they said, I have terrible news to bring you. I just discovered there's been a major hack. All of your bank accounts have been cleared out. Everything's gone. There's no money left. And then somebody else comes to you and says, I have a majorly bad news. There was a gas explosion in your home. Your home is totally wiped out. And while that message is still going on, somebody comes to you and says, I have really, really bad news. Somebody came and they stole all of your vehicles and your possessions. And while that one's going on, somebody comes and says, I have really, really bad news. We just found out there's layoffs in the company. You've lost your job. And these messages hit you back to back to back to back to back. That's what it would be like for Job. Job lost all of his economic stability in this one moment between these 3 messages. Totally, totally gone. And as if that's not enough to make for a really, really, really god-awful bad day, Job gets this message, because while the 3rd messenger was still speaking, another messenger comes, and this is the worst one of them all. Yet another messenger came and said, verse 18, your sons and your daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you. Now Job has lost his family. All 10 of his children are ripped from his hands immediately following the fact that his entire economic foundation is gone. This is completely unfair. This is so unfair. My question is, how would you respond? If this had happened to you, how would you respond? Would you flare up in anger? Would you scream at God, at the heavens? What would you do in this moment? You know, the first thing that we need to understand, guys, is just how real and powerful Satan actually is. You know, we underestimate the power and the authority that Satan has in this world. What we learn from this story is that Satan doesn't have total rule and authority. God lays a lot of protection on our lives and gives us a lot of peace and prosperity and protection to keep us from the work of the enemy. But Satan is real, and we need to stop pretending that the enemy is not what the scriptures say he is. Satan shows up in the book of Genesis, and he causes Adam and Eve to fall into sin and bring the chaos of sin into the world. Satan shows up here in the book of Job to attack and destroy his life. Satan shows up in the book of Daniel and blocks Daniel's prayers off. Satan is all over the scriptures. He shows up in the book of Revelation. He shows up in the Gospels when demons are inhabiting people and the disciples and Jesus are having to cast demons out of people. Satan is all over the place. Satan shows up when he tries to tempt Jesus into sin to keep him from fulfilling the mission of the gospel. We need to stop pretending that Satan isn't real and start believing what the Word of God tells us about him. Now, I don't think that Satan is behind everything that goes wrong in your life. I don't think he's behind every bad day and every moment of every bad day in your life. We can probably carry it too far. But Satan's behind some of them, I can tell you that. What we learn from the Scriptures is that Satan is determined to destroy the people of God. He is ruthless. He is heartless. He would take your life in an instant if God would allow him to do it. And he would do it in a torturous way. Satan is not playing games, and so we should not play games with him. The problem is that we as people don't get to see into the spiritual realm to really understand what's going on. We can't see when it is that Satan's behind something in our lives. And Job, as the character of the story, is not given the information that we're given in the story. He doesn't get to see that Satan is behind everything. Satan attacked his family and killed them. Satan sent fire on his sheep. Satan sent the Chaldeans. Satan sent the Sabians. Job can't see any of it, which means that Job's only interpretation is to believe wrongly, because it's the only interpretation that he can come to, that it's God who's done all this to him. When in fact, it's not God. God is actually so proud of Job that he spoke highly of Job to Satan. That's what God does in the story. It's Satan who's behind the attack. But Job can't see any of it. And here's the problem. When you're in the midst of a really, really bad day, man, when you're in the midst of a season of life when everything is going wrong, when the job is lost, or the relationship with the child falls apart, or the marriage is disintegrating, or the financial wealth in the family is disappearing, or something is just terrible going on, a loss of a loved one, when you're in the midst of that kind of season, you can't see the bigger picture in the way that Job couldn't see it. It's hard to know what we're supposed to do when something like this happens, because we don't get to see everything that God sees. And it really won't be until we get on the other side of heaven, when we're in the kingdom of God, when we get to see what was really going on. I can't wait for that day. I can't wait for God to explain to me. When I look back on my story, when God could say, I was there, and I was there, and I was there, and here's where Satan was involved, and here's what was going on here, and here's the bigger plan that was here. I can't wait to see that day. But in this life, on this side of the kingdom of God, on this side of heaven, we don't get that, do we? We just have some bad days that hit us, and we have to try to figure out how to live through them. So how do you live through a bad day? If something like this were to happen to your life, what do? I want to tell you what I believe is the most common human, emotion-filled response to pain in our interaction with God. Our natural reaction as people in this moment is to want to sit down in this chair, and this is the chair of judgment against God. Now, I'm going to share this. I'm going to share this principle and this reality in our lives, and I don't mean to bring more pain, because maybe you're in a seat right now. Maybe you've been sitting in this chair for a while with God. But I want to show you what's wrong with this. When we are in the midst of pain and in the midst of trial, our most natural reaction is to want to sit right here in the chair of judgment and say, God, I, as a human being, cast judgment on you for all the ways you're doing things wrong in my life. You're not meeting my expectations. You're not answering my prayers. You're not doing what I want you to do. This is unfair. I try to live a right life and do the right thing, and you seem to be against me. And so I sit in this chair, and I cast judgment on you. And this is totally normal and natural to do, is it not? I mean, we feel justified in the chair of judgment against God. When things go wrong and things just go off course in our lives, we feel justified to want to sit here and to say, I, as a finite human being with a very limited understanding of what's going on around me in the world, am going to cast judgment on an infinite God who sees and knows everything. A God who is immovable, a God who is immutable, a God who has total and perfect knowledge and wisdom, a God who's working out a big plan all the time, and yet we feel justified to sit in the seat of judgment and cast judgment on God. You ever been tempted to sit in the seat of judgment and cast some judgment on God? I'll tell you a time in my life when I really wanted to sit here. When I really, really wanted to sit here. Just a moment of confession. And it was the day that I got a call from my mom for the third time telling me that cancer had reemerged in her life. Our cancer journey with my mom started on a Thanksgiving trip. We went in to visit my parents in central Pennsylvania, and my mom was itching all over her body. Her skin was turning weird shades of color. We didn't understand what was going on. She goes and she's trying to go to doctor after doctor to get to the bottom of her symptoms. People are giving her wrong diagnoses. Nobody seems to know what's happening. They're giving her skin creams to try to deal with the itching. And finally somebody says, we ought to explore and find out if you've got bile backing up in your system. And so they ran a test, they run a scan, and what they discover is that there is a tumor in her bile duct that's blocking up the bile and causing all the symptoms. And that day started a cancer journey for our family. It was a cancer journey I didn't want to live through. It was a cancer journey that was never in my plans, never in my wife's plans, never in my sister's plans or my brother's plans, never in my dad's plans. It wasn't in any of our vision for our future of where we were going to go or what we were going to do. It felt totally unfair that my mom, a righteous and honorable woman, would be given cancer at 63 years old. She ends up having to go through a major surgery, a Whipple procedure is what it's called, and it's just a very invasive, very traumatic surgery on her body to remove everything that could possibly have cancer in it. She fights the cancer off one time, the cancer reemerges. Now she goes through chemotherapy and radiation. We fight the cancer back a second time. We're rallying people together in prayer for her. And after the second time, we felt like we got it. It's finally done. The cancer journey is over for our family. And then it was probably about a year and a half ago that I was sitting in this worship center and I was working in that tech booth and I was just doing some stuff on slides for the weekend service. And my phone rings and it's with my mom and she tells me the bad news. She's gone back for another scan, and there's more spots on her liver. They found more cancer. I've never had a time in my life where I wanted to sit in the judgment seat and cast judgment on God for what he was doing as that day. I wanted to sit here because it felt totally unfair. Totally unfair. God felt like he was unwise. God felt like he was unloving. God felt like he was uncaring. God felt like he was just ignoring my prayers. I had prayed so hard for her healing. I wanted to sit in this chair. I knew I wasn't supposed to, but this is where I wanted to be because I wanted to tell God all the ways that he wasn't meeting my expectations for my life or for my family. And this is our natural position that we want to get into when we have a bad day, is it not? We want to sit here and cast judgment on God. And if ever there's been a person in this world who had every right to sit in that chair, it would have been Job. I mean, Job goes through the total loss of his economic foundation, all of his money gone, the total loss of all of his children, the total loss of all of his servants except for four. 4 servants make it out of this thing. Everybody else is gone. His whole entire business is gone. Everything, gone. Gone. If ever there were a time where somebody would have been justified to sit in the chair of judgment and cast judgment on an infinite God, it would have been Job. Job would have had every right to do it. But Job does something totally different, and I want you to listen to Job's response. This series that we're going through, How to Live Through a Bad Day, I always want our series to be practically helpful for you. I want them to actually be helpful for you so that when you go through things in life or you move through life, that you can draw back on these sermons and these messages and say, I know how to deal with this problem. I know how to deal with this pain. I know how to deal with this situation or this person in my life. And this is where we're going to learn how to live through a bad day. Because Job goes through the worst of the worst of the worst of bad days. 4 messengers have just ruined his world. Here's what Job does. Verse 20. At this, Job got up and he tore his robe and he shaved his head, which is all a sign of mourning of his day. And here's what he does. Then he fell to the ground in worship. Job actually worshiped God. Here's what he said to God. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job, in the midst of his worst day, teaches us something about how to survive, how to live through a bad day, and it's this. Here's your lesson for today. Worship when you're at your worst. Worship when you're at your worst. The temptation is to sit here and cast judgment on God. The temptation is to position ourselves here. Job chooses not to position ourselves here. You know where he positions himself? He positions himself right here, flat on his face, before a holy God. This is Job's posture and position. And he worships God. And he says, God, everything that I ever had in my life, every one of those sheep, every one of those camels, every one of those children, every one of those oxen, every one of those donkeys, every one of those servants are something that I came into this world without having in my hands. And when I depart this world, I'm not going to have it in my hands either. It was all a gift from you to begin with. And so I praise the name of the Lord. May the name of the Lord be praised. Naked I came into the world. Naked I'm going to go out of the world. Job chooses to worship on his worst of days. And I'm telling you, Pathway, if you're in the midst of a really bad season right now, this is the posture you need to take. Everything feels like your right posture ought to be to judge God and be angry at him. But the truth is, you have imperfect knowledge. You can't see if Satan is behind what's going on in your life. You can't see the bigger picture of where God's moving. I can't see what God was doing with my mom's death from cancer. You can't understand. I can't understand. We're finite people who don't have a perfect picture of life. But God does have a perfect picture. And God still sits on his throne, and he's still a righteous and good king. And God still loves you. And his love for you on your worst day is so immense and overwhelming you can't even grasp how much he loves you, even when it feels like he doesn't love you. Which is why the posture you need to take is one of worship. Worship on your worst days. Don't sit in the seat of judgment of God. When you're in the midst of a relationship falling apart, when you're in the midst of a marriage falling apart, when you're in the midst of a financial breakdown, the loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, something just going totally wrong in your life, fall on your face and worship God. And say, God, everything I have is from you. Everything I have is from you. And so I'm going to choose to worship you on this day. You see, Job doesn't know that God is actually using him to write a story that we could preach messages like this thousands of years later. Job is totally unaware that that's what God is going to do with his story. Job doesn't know there's going to be this thing called a Bible. That's going to be a collection of these writings over thousands of years. Job doesn't know that he's going to be one of the central figures in the Bible. He's totally unaware of that. He doesn't know any of that. He couldn't see the bigger picture. And you can't see the bigger picture either when you're in the midst of your bad day and in the midst of your pain, which is why worship is the appropriate response to God. And Job teaches it to us here. Now, in the next few weeks of this series, I want you to walk back through the rest of the series with us. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a break from this series for 1 week next week, because next week is our 2nd birthday as a church. Isn't that awesome? And I'm not going to come in on our birthday celebration and talk about pain. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to have a really awesome celebration. And then we're going to pick this series up on the backside. A quick word on next week. It's our 2-year anniversary. It's so awesome. We're going to baptize a lot of people. And I want to tell you, if anything's been stirring in you about the possibility of being baptized, there is still time to jump in. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a meeting right after this service out here in the Megabytes Cafe. We're going to pick up some pizzas and just give you some water. We're going to explain baptism to you. If you don't know a lot about it, invite you to be baptized. We actually have a room over here set up with a green wall where we shoot our baptism videos. And if you want to just jump in and say, you know what, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to get baptized next week. You don't need a big, long process to do it. Just show up at the meeting after our service. Come and shoot your baptism video. And we'll get you baptized next week, and it will be awesome. Next week is going to be amazing. It's going to be an amazing service. Here's the thing. If you are afraid of being baptized because of the video, sometimes people come to me and say, I'm totally terrified by the video. That's okay. Come and have a conversation, all right? I will not drag you kicking and screaming into the video. I will try one good time to convince you why you should shoot the video and tell everybody of your story. But if you still resist, I'll say, okay, we'll baptize you without a video. But your story is powerful, okay? So come if you want to do that. And we're going to pick up this series after our 2-year celebration. We're going to pick it back up, and we have 3 more weeks of it. And what we're going to see is that for the next 20 chapters, what happens in the story is that Job's friends give some really bad words to him. And we're going to talk about the voices and the people you need in your life when you're in the midst of a season of pain, the kinds of people you need around you. Then we're going to go later into the story. We're going to see Job's wrestling match with God, where Job begins to cry out to God and say, God, I don't understand. And he begins to make his own defense for why he thinks that God shouldn't have done what he did to him and how he deals with the silence of God. We're going to talk through how do you deal with it when God isn't answering you, or maybe he's not showing up and giving you answers. And then we're going to go into the final week, and we're going to see the total restoration of Job. How Job actually, everything comes full circle, and God restores him again, which gives us hope at the end of our journey, hope at the end of our pain. You don't want to miss the rest of this series. So come to our 2-year celebration next week and join us throughout the remainder of the series as we learn how to live through a bad day. Would you pray with me?